for our political panel of the afternoon. Liberal MP Tony Passon joins us from Adelaide and Ali from the Labor Party from Perth. Thank you both for your time. Tony Passon, can I start with you on drought? I know an issue you've been keeping a very keen eye on. We're getting a response officially unveiled, but the understanding from what we heard from the Minister is, in terms of council rates and relief from that, it's not going to come from federal government coffers. The federal government wants the state government to come to the party. Is that fair enough?
Well, Tom, good to be with you this afternoon. Of course it's fair enough, because ultimately your local governments are products of state governments, and if there's to be rate relief, that should come from state governments. Our government is investing $1 million, or it has to this point invested $1 million via the Drought Community Funds for each and every council in my electorate. That's 9 of them. It's a great program. I hope it continues, but it's a matter ultimately for the leadership team. But when it comes to rate relief, that's a decision for individual councils. They can make that, of course, on their own balance sheets. But where the support doesn't come from there, it should come from state governments who need to step up in this space, quite frankly.
And Ali, do you agree?
Well, I think it's about time the government started doing something. Anyone would think the drought started yesterday. Look, I noticed that the government is still talking. About time they did more walk and less talking, I think. And, you know, the government needs to release the reports that were done by the Drought Commissioner and the Drought Envoy that they had. We'll wait and see what they come up with, but I just think it's about time. And it's about time there was some bipartisanship on this and that the government came to the party. That Labor offering to sit down with the government and have a drought cabinet. Let's get this done.
But on
Tom,
this specific
that's a
element,
ridiculous contribution.
Sorry?
Go on, then.
To suggest that's a ridiculous contribution. To suggest our government hasn't stood side by side with drought-affected communities is ridiculous. There's been $7 billion invested in dealing with the effects of this drought to this point. And in my councils, many of whom are directly affected, I can tell you they're incredibly grateful for the support they've received. So, and let's not suggest that there hasn't been a response to this drought, because there has been, and indeed historically it's much greater than we've seen in the past.
I'm not the one that's suggesting it. I think that a lot of people have been saying the same thing. Well, a lot of people have been saying it, Tony. I'm not saying it off the back of my own here. This is something that the NFP have called for, that people have been calling for. NFF, sorry, have called for, that a number of people have called for. I think it's most Australians think that the government has not done enough in this space.
The NFF saying they'd want more done. Look, they did say that they believe, Tony Passon, there was no long-term drought strategy from the government, which is going to come. But it's true that they've been disappointed in the lack of long-term vision, and you've, in a way, I guess, agreed with that before on this program, saying that, well, in hindsight, it might have been better to have more things in place earlier.
Tom, if we look historically, our nation hasn't done drought response well. We address drought during droughts, and we don't look to build that resilience during the wet years. But of course, Tom, you know that there's a 3-phase to our approach, and the final phase is building for the future, and that's why we've established the Drought Future Fund, $3.5 billion growing to $5 billion, $100 million investment year on year on year.
Right.
I'm happy to talk about the NFF's policy paper. I've looked at it in detail. To be honest, there's not a lot new in it. And I think it's fair to say that we are doing a lot to support farmers in drought, or at least that's the response I'm getting from my electorate that is in drought.
Can I just ask, Tony Passon, that we spoke to the Minister this afternoon about the possibility of moving drought into Prime Minister and Cabinet. This often happens when there's a real need to shine a spotlight on something. He left that option on the table, saying, well, he was remaining Minister, but that might happen. Would that be a good idea?
Tom, you and I both know that's well above my pay grade. What I can tell you is, irrespective of where this policy responsibility lands, the Prime Minister has it as a first order issue. I can guarantee your listeners that is the case. The Prime Minister regards this not only as the first call on the budget, which is something he said in question time, but in terms of his dealings interpersonally with colleagues in his team, I can assure you it is a first order issue for him, and so it should be.
And Ali, I want to ask you about something you've been in the media on recently, a new committee within Labor, within the caucus, to focus on multicultural affairs. What's needed here? What's missing?
I just think, Tom, that over the last 30 years, our conception of multiculturalism, our understandings of multiculturalism hasn't really progressed. You know, multiculturalism is still about celebrating diverse cultures as long as it, you know, is colourful and tastes like chicken. So I think we need to progress what we mean by multiculturalism. When I think of culture, for example, I know that my culture is very different to my mother's culture, is very different to my son's cultures. Culture itself is fluid and it's very subjective. Multiculturalism applies as much as it does to ethnic communities as it does to the difference in culture between the inner city and the bush, for example. So I think we need to reconceptualise what we mean by multiculturalism and how we talk about multiculturalism and how we engage people in that conversation.
So you're saying it's no longer just about ethnicity, but other divides within Australia?
Yeah, look, I think when multiculturalism was first put on the table in the 1970s, it was presented as a policy for managing new waves of migrants from non-Western European backgrounds, enabling them to retain some of their culture. And it resulted in the establishment of SBS, for example, translating services, English language, those kinds of things. But I think it's moved on from that as we have second, third, fourth generation people from different cultural or ethnic backgrounds. And the concept of culture itself is it's a very nuanced concept. It's not just about, you know, people who have just come from overseas and settling into Australia. It's about all Australians.
All right, well, what do you think about this, Tony Passon? Maybe particularly for you, the country-city divide. Is that something that needs to be put in this sort of box, the way it's tackled, I guess?
I don't think it necessarily finds itself in the discussion around multiculturalism, but there certainly needs to be a conversation about the differing nature and the between metropolitan living and metropolitan Australians and rural, regional and remote Australians. I wouldn't push it into a conversation about culturalism or multiculturalism. But I'm someone who's very passionate about the future of regional Australia, and as we have less farmers, and we have that because more and more farmers are seeking scale, so there are smaller number, lesser farmers for the same area, there's less opportunity to go visit your cousins or uncles on holidays. So I think there's an important conversation to be had about understanding life outside of our metropolitan centres. But I wouldn't push the conversation into multiculturalism, although I think what Anne is saying is right, and it's a valid discussion to be having about different cultures in our community. I come from a multicultural background myself, and I think it's important that we have that discussion.
I actually remember farm stays growing up. I wonder if they are a dwindling sort of existence in Australia. Maybe we'll talk about farm stays another day. Tony Passon, let's cover off something you might well have an opinion on. The Inner West Council in Sydney is going to scrap Australia Day celebrations in favour of Aboriginal festival Yabun. Now, it's still going to hold citizenship ceremonies on Australia Day. So is it free to make a choice on what it actually celebrates?
Well, Tom, my view is that we're now in a situation where continued conversation about Australia Day is effectively becoming divisive. And I want to celebrate Australia Day not because of where we came from, but the point at which we've arrived at. Very much what Anne was talking about in terms of that multicultural melting pot. Now, councils can make their own decisions, but I think it's equally important that Australians who want to become Australian citizens should be entitled to do that on our national day, and that is Australia Day. And if councils don't want to facilitate that, then I think there should be a serious consequence for that, and that is taking away their ability to conduct citizenship ceremonies generally.
Well, can you do that, though, in this circumstance? They're still going to hold citizenship ceremonies, but they're choosing not to celebrate Australia Day on that day. So are you forcing them to actually celebrate Australia Day? Because they're not contravening what did come in, that if you don't have citizenship ceremonies on that day, you can't hold them. That's not what they're doing here.
No, I understand that, and they're being quite cute. But let's leave the cuteness of that, particular idiosyncratic position to one side. The reality here, Tom, is we want an Australia that comes together to celebrate its achievements, where it has arrived at. My daughter is as proud as her links to Italo-Australian culture as she is of Indigenous culture and the part that forms in the makeup or tapestry of Australian culture that she's a part of. And that's what we should be celebrating on Australia Day. And I think that's an exercise in bringing people together, and we should be focused on bringing people together. And quite frankly, where we've got energy for debates like this, we should be looking at the things that really matter for Australia's First People. You know, focusing on...
And Ali, where do you sit on this?
Bringing the gap in.
Yeah. Sorry, just
Yeah,
on
look,
time. But Ali, your thoughts on this?
Sorry, I think we're at a juncture now in Australia where I don't think we can continue the conversation about Australia Day without recognising that people take Australia Day in different ways, and it has particular connotations for our First Nations people. And I think we need to recognise that those connotations. As far as what councils do, I think that's a decision for councils, and that they do that with the cooperation of their electorates. I don't think that the federal government should be dictating to councils what they do or don't do. But I really think that we need to start recognising just what Australia Day means to different people, and
do you think we need a redefinition of Australia Day or a broader one?
I think we need to start at least a conversation around it, Tom. I mean, I think, you know, these attempts to try and shut down the conversation and things like that.
That's a constant conversation now.
Yeah, I get your point, but at what point are we going to come to some kind of resolution where we say, yeah, it's all very well for politicians like me and like Tony to say, you know, this is what Australia Day means, but the fact is it doesn't mean that to everybody. And I want to see an Australia Day or a celebration of our nationhood. You're never going to get one sort of universal
definition that everyone agrees on, are you?
Well, you might not, but you can get something that the majority agrees on, and you can at least acknowledge that for some people, particularly for our First Nations people, Australia Day doesn't represent the same thing that it represents to other people.
All right. We're nearly out of time. I wanted to get you just finally, Tony Passon, on a minimum price on milk, effectively including milk solids as well. One Nation moving. Labor will support the debate. Where do you sit on this?
Well, I'm not surprised we're at this position, Tom, particularly with Labor looking for any form of distraction away from its own particular issues. But the issue here is we deregulated the industry in 1999 in response to what the industry asked of us. The ACCC has looked at this industry recently, and at no point during that conversation did industry ask us to re-regulate them. The reality here is if we were to re-regulate, that would affect our trading position. The future here is about being an open trading environment, milk solids, cheeses, other things. Our export markets are key, and the industry themselves are not calling for this re-regulation. It's populist politics, and it's not helping Australian dairy farmers, because if it was, the industry themselves would be asking us to do it.
We'll take that as a no, and no doubt delve into it again perhaps next week. Tony Passon and Ali, appreciate your time today. Thank you.